Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to our random review. Today we're in Italy in 1974 for Street Law, starring Franco Nero and Barbara Bach, directed by Enzo Castellieri. This is probably the best Castellieri film that I've seen. He's fairly low down on the list of Italian genre directors, I think. He's more famous for his rip-offs of Jaws and rip-offs of other films. As an interview with him on this release by 88 Films, where he talks about, some of his westerns, like remaking The Wild Bunch shot for shot and taking from other films, as Italian genre cinema did in the 70s. But this one's kind of interesting, apart from in the sense it's one of Franco Nero's finest performances. But in actual fact, what kind of film it is. So this Street Law came out the same year as Death Wish, which is kind of interesting because they're both about a similar sort of thing, but it's just the difference between Italian, or if you want to go further, continental cinema and Hollywood cinema, even though obviously Death Wish was directed by an Englishman, Michael Winner. So Franco Nero stars as an engineer who is robbed, or is in a post office during a robbery, and he ends up being taken hostage and beaten up by the robbers, and he's so incensed at this as an attack on his pride that he wants to take revenge on the criminals. So far so standard, but as I said, this came out, I'm not sure which one came out first, but obviously Death Wish was in the same year, 1974. But again, this is the 70s in Italy, so it's officially a Years of Lead film, where real life violence was probably just as violent or even more violent than in cinema, and the cinema just reflected that. So it has an amazing title sequence where you just have random crimes being committed, but they just get increasingly more violent. So people are just held up and then shot in slow motion, and it's a fairly explosive and violent credit sequence. I mean, again, if you're familiar with the Years of Lead films from Italy, everybody's a target, doesn't matter, women, children, animals, cuddly toys, doesn't matter, everybody's a victim and everybody's liable to be assaulted, shot, blown up, drowned, stabbed, fired into space, doesn't really matter. But again, what makes Street Law different from Death Wish and things like Taken, more modern films like Taken or Nobody, and this is pointed out by Italian film expert Mike Malloy in a wonderful little video essay on the release, is the fact that, Franco Nero does not become like a badass vigilante like overnight. He doesn't go from being an engineer, being a square citizen, to suddenly being Rambo like the next day, which a lot of these sort of films do. His first kind of attempt to get information about these guys ends in a severe beating, and his car being damaged and being threatened. If he's ever seen in that kind of area or place again, he's going to be killed. So this isn't immediately becoming, just a death machine. By the time Death Wish 3 and Death Wish 4 happened, somebody looks at Charles Bronson the wrong way and he whips out a rocket launcher. Now, as much fun as that is, it's not very realistic, as if, obviously, films are realistic. So it's very, it might be disappointing for people who want to see, Franco Nero becoming Rambo overnight because he was robbed and beaten. But this film actually shows it, properly, as normal, quote, normal people are going to be treated roughly if they just walk into a place and go, I want information in these 3 thugs. So that's a really nice and almost unique thing in one of these films. Barbara Bach, who, to be fair, doesn't get that much to do, but she's not as, the word exploited might not be correct, but she doesn't have to get naked or anything like quite a lot of women in these kind of films do. She's Nero's girlfriend who basically just wants him to stop doing what he's doing, and they kind of have philosophical arguments, which again might have been slightly in the first Death Wish film, but not really in the series. But again, part of the Years of Lead was, of course, police corruption. So this is more to do with, again, the inability of the police, because at one point Nero becomes obsessed with these 3 guys, follows them, and then he phones a tip in at the police, and of course the police don't come. So he does get very frustrated and angry, so that's why he kind of wants to do it for himself. And as he realises that the police aren't really going to do anything, he almost sets the police up by leaving a tape of his investigations and claiming that he's got evidence of police and corruption and evidence that some police officer involved, and that's only when the lead detective actually starts being proactive and doing something about it. So even a sniff of, there might actually be police corruption, so either it's out of guilty conscience or actually wanting to snuff out corruption themselves, but that's only when the police take an interest, and of course by that time it's probably too late because Franco Nero's so far down the rabbit hole. There's a lovely kind of relationship between a lower level crook that Nero pretty much uses, tries to blackmail because he takes pictures of him doing a job, and that kind of antagonism between those 2 characters really works, and that relationship works well. Once the small time crook kind of tells Nero, why he does what he does, and he's hoping to get out of it and open like a garage. Nero softens a bit, but then for reasons there's double crosses and all that, but that relationship is really fun, because obviously there are cases where people get into crime because their back's against the wall, as opposed to the people that just get into crime because they just get the adrenaline rush. I mean, obviously vigilante films are always popular because it is a fantasy to go out and sort out all the bad guys in the world, but again, they're usually completely ridiculous, or you have these ordinary people, but it turns out they used to be a Navy SEAL or they used to be in the CIA or whatever, so they're very handy as opposed to literally somebody who has no training, and strange enough they would struggle. So I mean, Franco Nero does take a beating quite a lot. Obviously he doesn't do all of these stunts, but there are plenty of diving about and falling over and that Franco Nero does do. And there's a real vulnerability about his performance in the start, with no offence to Charles Bronson, but being vulnerable isn't necessarily what you would say in a Charles Bronson performance. But Nero does kind of go through the gamut of emotions, as far as going from somebody who thinks, the police should be doing a good job in stopping this, and then realising that they're just as helpless, and again, or they may be corrupt, to the imaginary scenarios that maybe we've all had of, sort this bad person out, and of course the reality of that doesn't go the way it did in your head. But then there's always that point of you're pushed too far. Every man's got his limitations, and at some point you have to fight back. I mean, the film almost ends on an optimistic note, which isn't necessarily the case in Italian films of the 70s. This is a really nice release. The print looks really good. There's a commentary with Eugenio Ercolani, who does a lot of the intros to Arrow Italian spaghetti western box sets, for example. Troy Howarth and Nathaniel Thompson. There's a shorter US Grindhouse cut, Sniff Around and Find Out, the featurette by Malloy, which is fantastic, as he does talk about the difference between films like Street Law, where the protagonist is completely normal, and the kind of modern version of these revenge stories where the character has a unique set of skills. There's an interview with Castellari, which is very funny. There's an interview with the composer, or composers, Guido and Maurizio De Angelis, because it's a really lovely score. Again, even these Years of Lead films, if they're not the best, usually the score is just wonderful, because Italian composers as a whole are probably the greatest film composers of all time. I know that's controversial Hollywood, but there it is. And there's an interview with the actor and stuntman Massimo Vanni, original trailer and TV spot, reversible sleeve, and also this wonderful slip cover. So again, if you're into spine numbers, it's spine number 83 of the Italian collection. I know these used to come without slip covers, so you could actually see the spine numbers in your shelf, but then they started doing slip covers, or special hard boxes for some of them. But it's just a fun, it is fairly brutal, as most of these Year of Lead's films are. I can't actually speak. But it's nice that it does have the non kind of, oh yes, you're a normal person, but then once something bad happens to you, you immediately turn into a killing machine like that. And it's like, yeah, that's not really how reality works. Not that I'm ever going to claim Enzo Castellari films are reality. That would be, what a strange reality that would be, that we all lived in. So thanks very much for watching this random review of Street Law. Another wonderful Franco Nero performance. He is an international treasure, really. So please let me know if you've seen Street Law and what you think about it, and hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.